I'll start, I guess, with the opening remarks. In case I haven't met you, my name is Wendy Craig, and I'm the scientific co-director of PREVNet, Promoting Relationships and Eliminating Violence Network. On behalf of our team, I'd like to welcome you to the webinar today. Before we start, I'd like to ask you to take a moment, wherever you're located, to join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous people who have cared for these lands and in celebrating their continued strength and spirit. I'm on a journey, and I am a fourth generation white settler. I'm currently traveling, so I'm on the Musqueam lands in Vancouver, BC, and Point Grey, and I'm very grateful to be able to have access to this unceded territory, and I'm grateful for the care that's been taken of the lands over the years. We're bringing you today's webinar from the Community of Practice to address teen and youth dating violence that's funded by the Public Health Agency Canada. The panel discussion today is entitled Strategies for Navigating Youth Consent in Diverse Contexts. Before I introduce the presenters today, I wanted to just go through our format. We have posted a link to all the presenter slides in English. You can find them now in the chat box. We'll run the webinar for about 75 minutes. We would really like the webinar to be as interactive as possible. So we really encourage you to ask questions along the way. If you don't want to put up your hand, feel free to put them in the chat box. We plan to have about 20 minutes at the end of the webinar to address your questions, but I've also talked to the presenters and we're happy to stop and have a little question and answer period at the end of each presentation. When we finish the webinar, you'll be asked to be sent a link to evaluate today's webinar. And it's really important to us that you participate in that if you can or feel able to, because they help us plan what we're going to do in the future. Please know it's anonymous and it takes less than 2 minutes to complete. Once you've completed that, you'll be directed to enter your full name and address, and there you'll be getting a certificate of an attendance that will be generated and mailed to you. We want to be sure to let you know that the evaluation is separate from the certificate, so those can never be connected. I also want to let you know that the webinar is being recorded today. So afterwards, we'll send out a link so that everybody registered can share, and please feel free to share the webinar or listen to it if you weren't, for others who weren't able to join us today. So that's it for my introductory remarks. I want to introduce the presenters, and we're very grateful for their knowledge and their expertise and their participation. I'm going to do a few introductory remarks. So my name's Wendy Craig. I've talked a bit about myself, but we also are very fortunate to have Meghan Fournie here with us, and she's a research coordinator at the Centre for School Mental Health at Western University in London, Ontario. She's worked in research for over 10 years in the areas of diabetes, Indigenous health, and youth mental health. She's passionate about community-based participatory and implementation research fields. We also have Julie Laliberte, and she's been working with the Liard Aboriginal Women's Society in Watson Lake, which is in the Yukon, and she's been doing that since 2015 on various projects, including Youth for Dignity. She's currently completing her master's degree in child and youth care at the University of Victoria. So we're very honored and grateful to have their presentations today and their participation. So I'm going to start just sort of by giving you a little bit of a preamble about why we're here and what brought this on. In our work in the community of practice, we've come to understand that the way that researchers have asked for consent or have been getting consent has been problematic in some ways. And so it's really brought a lot of researchers who work with diverse populations to think differently about what we need to be doing in consent, how we can go about it, and how it can be really, it should be a communication tool. When we obtain consent from others, we're communicating to others about the research, about the key elements of the research, and what their participation is involved. So on the one hand, we have this ethical and legal requirement to obtain that consent, but what we want to sort of move to is have this understanding that it's not a one-way process. We're not telling them about these things, but we're actually engaging with them and having an interaction to ensure that they understand what are the kinds of things that they're going to be doing and what are their rights as they go through this process. And we also need to make sure that we do it in a way that's accessible and that causes no harm. And that's really one of the things that's motivated this webinar today. Next slide, please. According to our research ethics, there are 4 things that we have to do in consent. And so in having this dialogue, you know, we have to have a dialogue and make it interactive, but we also have elements that as researchers, we have to ensure what's in that dialogue and the content of that dialogue. And the first piece that we have to do is we have to really be clear that this project is research and that their participation is voluntary. And we have to state that very clearly, and we have to make sure they understand what that means, that they can stop, they don't even have to begin the research, they can choose later to have their data withdrawn, but it's completely voluntary. The second thing that we have to do is we have to ensure that they have a summary of the research. And so they have to understand what the research is about, how long their participation is, and what's going to happen to them in that experience, and give them an opportunity to ask questions or understand that. The third thing that we have to include when we're obtaining consent is we have to make sure that we've acknowledged and clearly stated any foreseeable risks or discomfort. So is there anything that they're going to be uncomfortable with? We have to warn them. We also have a duty to provide supports with them to manage that. And then we have to also talk about what would be the reasonably expected benefits. So these are the fundamental aspects of consent that we have to include. And it's really important to sort of match, you know, how do we engage participants? How do we recruit participants? But how do we also make sure that we're being respectful of their rights, respectful of their safety, and ensuring that they know what they're signing up to? And today we're going to talk about a bit about what are some of the challenges, what are some of the barriers, and also how do we get over those? And how do we work with youth and their guardians to ensure that they're fully informed and able to participate in a research. And so, you know, some of the things that, you know, I've learned in my journey is that often we have language barriers, so that the language of science is really complex. The language, this legalese language that you find in consent forms is at a really high level. And in fact, most people, when you look at the average, there's been research on it, when you look at the level, the reading level of most consent forms, it's above grade 8. And so it's a very high level that it may be challenging for some people, like newcomers, like people who for English isn't a second language, for those who may have learning challenges and may read in a different way. So we really need to make sure that we are very clear and use simple and language. The second one is that, you know, how do we integrate those 4 things that we talked about that have to be in there for consent, those research requirements, into our work and do it in a way that's accessible. The other thing that's really important is often we're asking parents to consent, or guardians to consent, or caretakers or aunties to consent on behalf of children. And we also have to make sure that we have to respect children's rights, that children need to be informed and also consent. So we have to get their assent as well. So, we also have to think about and match how we're obtaining consent when we think about from whom we're consenting, like vulnerable individuals, like children. And we also have to recognize and respect that we're asking consent in a way that's respectful and understanding and reflects the cultural values of the context that we're working in. So really fortunate to have some really fabulous individuals here today that are going to be able to help us think about what are some of the things that they've experienced, how they've dealt with consent issues in their work, and some of these challenges. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Megan, and ask you to talk next.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm Megan. I am the research coordinator at the Center for School Mental Health. I use she, her pronouns. Typically I'm located at Western University, but today I am coming from my home here in Woodstock, which is the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Anishinaabeg communities. And really vibrant, large communities nearby of Six Nations of the Grand and Mississauga of New Credit First Nations. So just want to take a moment to acknowledge them. So today I'm going to discuss some intersecting considerations for informed consent with vulnerable youth across diverse settings that we work with in our projects. Discuss our experiences navigating guardian consent and when youth have been able to consent for themselves. And then within that, kind of discuss a little bit about how we've adapted our consent procedures with our community partners. So to give you some background, this presentation is based on our experience in the RISE-R project, which is in year 4 of 5-year grant. That has 4 main arms that aim to deliver and evaluate healthy relationships programming with high risk and vulnerable youth. And within each arm, we have distinct research projects, unique distinct research projects, and work with multiple community partners and school boards locally and across Canada to implement them. So first we have our Hrp-Enhanced program for high risk groups. And this area focuses our work with agencies such as Children's Aid Society, youth justice organizations, and community mental health services. Second, we work in partnership with community and school boards to deliver and evaluate the 2S LGBTQI+ youth program in gender and sexuality alliances, or GSAs, within schools. And then we also have our pilot and feasibility studies for delivering the healthy relationship program with newcomer youth, and work with various local newcomer organizations across Southwestern Ontario. And lastly, we do have, our project has focused mostly on adapting the Healthy Relationships program for Indigenous youth. So I'll be talking a little bit less about that because we haven't moved too much into the research aspect yet. But I know that the other presenters today are going to be touching on their experiences. So I'm going to highlight some key considerations for informed consent with vulnerable youth that we've learned through the last few years that have really intersected or overlapped across all 4 arms of our projects and the diverse community partners and the youth populations that are involved. So first, we ensured that our consent and our research procedures were flexible, recognizing and honoring the diverse partnering organization structures, policies, and unique needs of the youth. And an important process that we put in place was to have multiple meetings with our partners prior to launching our projects, and even prior to each group of youth that were participating in the program. During these meetings, we asked for their feedback on the research procedures and specifically any anticipated barriers to carrying out the research consent process, or just what would be the best and most ideal method for conducting informed consent. So these discussions focused on how we would integrate the process into their existing structures. And this can look really different depending on the organization and the youth involved. And there can even be diversity within the groups of youth, even within one organization that we work with. And the most feasible approach to consent could vary even between those groups. So as an example, with some of our work with youth justice organizations, they could be running the program with probation referrals, alternative education classes, youth living in shelters, pregnant or parenting teen moms. And so the most feasible approach to consent in any of those settings can be vastly different. Also, we integrated consent processes into their existing structures or policies for programming. So for instance, some organizations found it easier to do consent when doing the intake session for the program. So that would be like a one-on-one with youth. Whereas others opted to do like a group recruitment and consent sessions where Western research staff would come in and invite youth as a group to participate. And the goal here was just to address the needs of the individual youth and just streamline the consent process whenever possible. So we weren't adding like an additional task to what they were already doing for their programming or other services. Also, the best way to approach guardians could vary from site to site or group to group. And it all depends on the level of contact that our partners may have with guardians as part of their services and programs. So we needed a lot of different options for being able to reach out by telephone or reach out by email. So we learned in these through our meetings that we needed to provide flexibility in our consent procedures to fit a variety of different situations and settings. And so even before the pandemic hit, we started using online consent forms and verbal consent options to provide more flexibility and feasible means to document consent. These online and verbal consent options obviously became even more important when we needed to pivot our research during the pandemic. At the same time, we kept that traditional in-person paper written consent forms for those that required them. So our incarcerated youth or some of the youth that are in live-in mental health treatment programs required paper copies, as very obviously with limited access to the internet or anything like that. So our recruitment and consent procedures, as an example, within one project, we could have the in-person written or verbal consent with paper options, telephone. So a lot of maybe the intent, especially during the pandemic, intake sessions were done over the phone. So explaining to the youth over the phone or guardians what the project was about, and then documenting their consent on their behalf on a verbal consent form. Video conferencing also became even more important, and having online consent forms, like links to online consent forms sent through the chat. The other thing that we had to consider was getting, if we did get verbal consent in these cases, to do individual breakout sessions with each youth or guardian to make sure you're maintaining their confidentiality of their information. And then of course we had emails for guardians on online consent forms, and we found this to be particularly important in, for example, Children's Aid Society, where they may, it was more efficient for them to email, say, social workers or youth workers who had temporary guardianship of the youth. So it was really important. Excuse me. So the second consideration was to ensure the physical and emotional safety of the youth when they engaged in the research process. So outside researchers coming in can feel very intimidating and overwhelming for some of the youth, especially those with unique lived experiences. Due to past experiences, personally or historically, some of the youth may not trust researchers. And so there can be, and also there can be an intense feeling of judgment in the research process. So, often kids involved may be ongoing multiple assessments within the other services that they are receiving. And so this may add on to that, and that can feel very overwhelming, even though we're evaluating the program and not them on an individual basis. So their emotional safety is important to consider when recruiting and obtaining consent. And one specific strategy that we employed is for youth to participate in safe and controlled and familiar environments. So often that meant doing the research and consent process in the community where the programming itself took place, and also having program facilitators or other community staff present to provide that degree of comfort and reassurance. We also have some partners where staff are co-researchers and they actually undertake the consent process themselves. And however, like ethical guidelines would typically recommend that there was no or minimal interactions between partner staff and the youth during the informed consent process to ensure that the youth's decision is voluntary and minimize any undue influence due to the pre-existing relationship and services that the youth are receiving, as well as to maintain their confidentiality and their decision to participate or not from anyone outside the research team. However, in these circumstances, ensuring their safety and comfort were a higher priority than guaranteeing that facilitators were not actually physically present or aware of who consented or not. And so for that, we worked with our ethics board, and in applying for approval, we integrated key consent processes that are kind of already in place with most of the projects, but was to provide training for our community staff to understand the importance of the consent process, to ensure that they are covering, providing scripts to ensure that they are covering all the key points, that the youth understands the voluntary nature of the research, that their decision has no effect on their participation in the Healthy Relationships program or any other services they may receive, and then making it explicitly clear that the facilitators will know that they consented. And in our case, some of them are often actually helping with data collection as well. It's also was important to discuss with partners when it may not actually be appropriate to invite some of the youth to participate out of respect for concerns for their emotional safety. So even particularly early on in the pandemic, we identified cases where our partners just did not feel like the research would be a good fit at that time, as some of the youth may be going through some difficult circumstances in their lives. And I'm going to talk more about this when I talk about guardian consent. But it's important to mention here there with special consideration for the physical and emotional safety for 2S LGBTQI+ youth, as not all youth have disclosed their sexual orientation or their gender identity to their parents, and requiring them to disclose their identity to their parents as a condition for them to participate could actually increase their risk of parental abuse or rejection. And so, yeah, I'll get into that a little bit more after this next part. And Wendy already mentioned this a little bit, but was literacy and language support was across all of our arms is very important when working with high risk and vulnerable youth settings. So we have youth with varying levels of literacy who have faced systemic and multiple barriers to education through their life. And we have direct discussions with our partners for each group ahead of recruitment, just to determine any particular needs of the youth that are involved in that group at the time. And it takes extra time, but it has to be a priority to make that information accessible. Either we are reading the letter of information out loud to a group or to them individually, rephrasing areas as needed to ensure that the youth fully understands what activities they are consenting to and the risk and the benefits. And without taking that extra effort, we may be unintentionally excluding some youth from participating, or youth may not truly understand what they're consenting to or be truly informed. Oops. Another consideration is for any youth, but particularly for vulnerable youth and those with lower literacy or learning disabilities, or those multi-page letters of information can feel extremely overwhelming. And this is something we're continually working with our research ethics board about, because they can be highly detailed to the point where you're listing the server of online, the location of server of online software. So importantly, and those, they can be about 5 pages long and can feel very overwhelming. So importantly, during a recent meeting with some co-researchers from our partner sites, they shared how verbal consent option has been convenient, but it's also helped them in, excuse me. Sorry about that. It's also helped them informalize the process for some of the youth, so that they may find that written consent in the large amounts of paperwork intimidating or overwhelming. And then with our newcomer groups, again, we'll have discussions with our partners ahead of recruiting the group of youth to learn more about any language supports that they may need to ensure that the youth can be involved in the research. And of course, having materials translated whenever possible. And the level of language support that may be needed can vary from group to group. We may have some youth who are more fluent where their parents might need language support. And we'll also have either a staff member or community partner staff attend to the recruitment sessions to provide any support as needed. And often in these cases, the youth and the parents are attending the sessions together whereas in some of our other projects, that, it can be a bit of a separate process. Sorry about that. I tend to get dry throat when I'm doing my presentations. Okay, so yeah, those were the three main considerations that really overlapped a lot of our projects. So next I'm going to talk a little bit more about our experience with guardian consent. So our programs are typically run with 14 to 21-year-olds, so we don't have a lot of youth like under 12 years old. So within the community though, 16 is typically the age of consent, as they are presumed to have the capacity to make decisions. Whereas in school boards, age of consent is 18 years old. And so it's important to note that there is no actual age of consent listed in the Tri-Council policy statement, and it advocates for an approach based on decision making. And so that's enabled us to get waivers for guardian consent. And while we aim to obtain guardian consent whenever possible, we have made justifications to our REB. And these were to align with policies of some of our community partners. So in youth correction settings in particular, they have policies around not contacting guardians. And so they make the assumption that if the youth are able to consent to participate in the program, they also have the ability to consent for research as well. Also, youth who are experiencing homelessness or unstable living arrangements and would not have access to guardian consent to participate in research. The TCPS also states that research should be fair and equitable in deciding who can participate. However, the requirement for guardian consent may actually inadvertently be silencing them from participating and excluding them from participating. And we have to make the effort to not do that according to being fair and equitable in our TCPS. And as I mentioned, we also submitted justifications for waiving guardian consent to prioritize the safety of 2S LGBTQI+ youth, so that there wasn't the requirement for them to disclose their sexual orientation or gender identity to their parents, or just excluding them from being able to participate. And overall, we've been able to get the approvals by emphasizing that our research presents minimal risk. And we are also ensure that youth have the capacity to consent for themselves. Also, we encourage youth to speak to a trusted adult before making a decision. Or for 2S LGBTQI+ youth, if they don't feel like it would put them at risk, to talk to their parents. It's important to note that even though our REB has approved these, because there is no age of consent outlined in the Tri-Council policy statement, not always do the school boards or other research boards approve this, and in some cases we do have to get guardian consent. So with that, I wanted to just finish off by sharing more on our project with 2S LGBTQI+ youth to illustrate how requiring guardian consent can impact your research. So we conducted a survey with 60 youth in one local school board and one community support center. And all youth were able to consent for themselves. The school board we worked with waived guardian consent because they felt the research was important and wanted to give everyone the opportunity to participate. On the survey, youth were asked, if you were required to get consent from your guardian, would you still have participated? And 22 had said no. And so we wanted to look at the demographic differences between the youth who said yes, they would participate regardless of guardian consent, and those who said no, that they would not have participated. So here we go again. Youth who are white, older, cisgender, living and felt gender all the time were more likely to say yes. They would have participated regardless of consent. Those who said no, they would not have participated if guardian consent was required, were more likely to have negative attitudes towards their identity, less family support, and more anxiety. So the results of this study demonstrated that by requiring guardian consent, you could be missing the most vulnerable to as LGBTQIA+ youth and getting a biased pictures of the types of risks, needs, and intervention outcomes for youth. But as stated in the Tri-Council policy statement, we have the responsibility to collect information about all people impacted by the problem area, even if it is difficult to recruit them. And so that is it. And I can send, there's the link if you want to read more about that study, and I can send that through the chat, I believe. And I think we're going to take questions now. Anyone has any?
Great, thanks, Megan. We really appreciate it, and I really like how you sort of organized it for us, sort of around your 3 buckets of process, content, and support. I think those was really great. Because of timing right now, we're just going to go on to the next presentation, and maybe if people have questions, we can save them for the end.
Okay.
So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Julie.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, wherever you are. I'm just going to test my screen share. Is the screen that you can see right now the PowerPoint?
We can see the slides on one side and your main slide.
Okay, so I'll just, now it's full screen for you all?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Perfect, thank you. So I don't know if I'll be able to see the chat. So if anything happens, just if someone want to unmute themselves and let me know.
I got your back.
Thank you. So hi, everybody. My name is Julie Laliberte, and because relationships are so central to consent and to my work, I thought that I'd start by introducing myself and the project to give you guys an idea of what the project is. So I use she, her pronouns, and I am Dutch and English on my mom's side and 12th generation French Canadian on my dad's side. And I'm currently zooming in from the unceded and stolen territories of the Wasanich and Lekwungen people in what is currently known as Victoria. And I say currently because with my work and life, I'm always striving for return of land and sovereignty to the rightful owners of this land. And I have been working with laws, the Liard Aboriginal Women's Society, since 2015. And there's a picture of my co-facilitator, Renee Claude Carrier, and her son, Teo, who's a little older than that now. And I have a little bit of a different, I'm not actually a researcher on this project. I'm a facilitator, so it's a little bit of a different perspective, although I am in grad school and doing my own research that is involved with this project as well. So I've been thinking about research and consent in my work and then in my studies as well. And I'm always asking myself in all of the work that I do, like, what is my business here? And I think that's an important question to ask with consent. And I'm always asking, like, what am I doing here? Why am I here? What is my business here? And what kind of feelings of entitlement are wrapped up in my work, especially as a white settler researcher or facilitator or just person in general? And how can I divest from white supremacy in my personal and professional life? So today I will be, before you, a little outline of what we're going to be talking about today. Emma Rader is my boss, and she's on the far right of this photograph alongside some elders and the Kaska language teacher, Linda McDonald, who supports our project. And so today, we're introducing Youth for Dignity, or Ts'ídāne, which means it's like a pretty loose translation of Youth for Dignity in Kaska. And I'm going to be talking about navigating consent in the research and building safety. And I'm hoping to show a video at the end as well. So just to locate the project, I'm not sure where everyone else is in Canada, but Watson Lake is that little dot. And you can see, this is kind of a hard map on the right here, but Casca territory extends pretty far north in the Yukon, and then it does go down into BC as well. This is a colonially drawn map. And so Watson Lake, it's kind of hard to see, is right there. And the First Nation is called the Liard First Nation. And one thing that's important to note is that there's 14 First Nations in the Yukon. And the Liard First Nation is one of 3 that haven't signed a final land claims agreement yet. So their territory is still unceded. They have not given consent for anyone to be there. And you can see that it's alongside one of the highways up into the Yukon. So it's very well traveled. It's about 800 people. And I used to live in Whitehorse, which is right here. Can you see my cursor? So I used to live in Whitehorse for about 6 years, and that's how I kind of got hooked into the project. So it's about a 5-hour drive to Watson Lake there. And BC is just right there. So there's students who are in BC as well, who attend the high school where the project is. So in terms of stats, the Yukon has about 3 to 4 times the national average of violence against women or gendered violence, and Watson Lake has even higher than that. And in terms of some other stats, I think these are probably not the most accurate, but they're general, which is probably like, oh my God, for researchers are like, you need that anyways. But yeah, so around 80% of women know the offender of who has either raped them or assaulted them, and it's even higher in the Yukon at about 94%. So the ideas around the project are guided by the Liard Aboriginal Women's Society and Dana Ottson, which means dignity or respect for all. And we have elders attached to the project who support it. It's grounded in response-based practice, which is an amazing theoretical and practice framework I encourage you all to check out. It's based in activism and social justice, increasing community safety and decreasing gendered violence. So the project exists in Watson Lake Secondary School, and so there's grades 8 to 12. We typically have about 15 to 20 youth who kind of fluctuate in, and we're in, I think, year 4 of a 5-year project. And we typically go down once a month, and there's a 3-day session from usually about October till May. There's myself and Renee Claude, who's the other facilitator. There's Linda McDonald, who's the Casca language teacher, which is Casca is the language spoken there. And typically 2 or 3 elders who come in. And yeah, we focus on building relationships, learning about social justice issues, and developing campaigns. We do a lot of small and large group discussions in a circle format, and we do a lot of experiential activities to do our educational side of things and watch videos and play games and do quizzes and surveys. Here are some of the main themes, including dating violence, of course, gendered and sexualized violence, and consent. And some of the campaigns and projects that the youth have come up with over the years. This is one of the elders, Rose Caesar, and a red dress project that we made that's now in a beautiful glass case that lives in the high school for murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit people. And we've made murals, we've done hoodies. We made all of these, I don't know if you saw the Stop Rape signs, and put them in the signpost forest, which is like the main attraction in Watson Lake. It's like this area with like probably thousands of signposts. I don't know if anyone's come up there, but it's yeah, it's pretty cool. And there's a photo of us at a mural unveiling that we did with the youth and some of the elders, and the drums that they made as well. So yeah, it's been I have a bit of a different position around the research, but the research project is, the question is kind of like to help understand how Youth for Dignity, or YFD, build safety skills and knowledge on gender-based violence and brings about positive change for youth. And because we've been working with laws since 2015, many of the participants and their families know about Youth for Dignity and have been kind of signing consent forms and are kind of used to, they're used to the program in the community. Most people are, or they've had, they participated or been to a community event. And yeah, so we've kind of already started like the relationship, or the relationship is already there in a lot of ways, and also not, because Renee lives in Whitehorse, so we don't live in the community. And the research team comes up from Vancouver, although because of COVID, they haven't been coming up as much. And so that's why we as facilitators have kind of taken on that role, which kind of Meghan alluded to in terms of the issues of ethical considerations with research, but that's what we have to work with. So we have both a consent form for youth to sign and one that goes home to their guardians to sign off on. And there's also the option of getting verbal consent from guardians over the phone if it's an issue to get the forms back, or if the youth keep forgetting, or and one thing that we try to keep in mind when talking about families is that not everyone has, like, everyone has different structures and relationships to family, to be careful about language about like your parents, or especially the more heteronormative, like your mom and dad language. Try to stay away from that, and to validate the like non-nuclear family structure that exists for so many youth. And this is all kept organized by the oral consent log that we have a record keeper that I forgot to mention, sorry, Kirsten, and she has been wonderful in terms of keeping track of all the forms as Renee and I are kind of like buzzing around doing the facilitation thing. And there are also options on those consent forms for the youth to opt in and opt out of the separate research activities like the interviews or the surveys. And yeah, I think that it's kind of an interesting situation because our project talks a lot about consent, and that we have the ability, we do a lot of team building and things like that. So one of the ways that we build safety and consent in the group is by co-creating group agreements, and this puts more accountability with the youth and outlines boundaries such as confidentiality. And a key principle in a program is challenge by choice, which if anyone's worked in like outdoor ed or other frontline work like that, that's a kind of a outdoor education term or a team building term. And explaining that like almost everything is something that the youth can opt out of, barring a few like safety things. And that the youth can always say no to anything in the program, however frustrating that is as a facilitator sometimes. We really try to respect their no's. And another exercise we do early on to build relationships, trust, and safety is called the comfort donut. And I couldn't find an image online of this, and I have no idea where I picked this up from. Yeah, I have a background in outdoor ed and guiding and things like that, but you probably have heard about comfort zones before, but it's an interesting exercise to get people thinking about the differences in comfort zones and consent. So in the middle of your donut, we talk about the comfort donut. In the middle of the donut, so this blue zone is your comfort zone, and it's like warm and cozy and safe, but you're not eating any donut, like there's not really anything happening. And then as you start to push yourself and take risks, you start to eat some of this nice donut, and it like can be really uncomfortable, but you're getting this like nice donut. But then if you eat too much of it and you got no more donut left, you're in your danger zone, and it's like you can panic. It's like not a therapeutic place to be. And so what we do is, after explaining this, we lay out ropes on the floor in like these concentric circles or this donut shape, and then we get the whole group to stand where they like where they feel their comfort zone is. So we call out different scenarios, like talking in front of your class, and they all kind of like move around based on like their comfort zone. And some of them are like almost out the door, or how comfortable do you feel intervening in violence or in bullying or racism? And it's like a visual way to see that everyone has different comfort donuts, and we also need to respect these. And also it can give you some language or ability to tell when they're pushing themselves in an okay way and when it's like, no. And so we hope that that this can all lead to them feeling more comfortable and safe to say no to, well, anything but to us, and to also get them more ready and honest for any kind of input they're going to give towards research. And I think that a youth are put in situations a lot of the time where they don't want to be, and they don't have the ability to say no. And that's why we kind of try to give them as much choice as possible. And I think the importance of relationship is strong here, because if I have a certain relationship with the youth and I feel like I can kind of push it and be like, are you sure? Like, can we try this? And then if I know that they're going to feel comfortable to be like, no, Julie, forget it. Like, I'm not doing this. Like, I'm not doing this. And we do a lot of other team building and debriefing exercises to build safety and trust in the group. And it hopefully expands everyone's comfort zones and like their willingness to share what they're going to share about. But it also, means that they'll be more comfortable to say no if they don't want to talk about anything or do anything. And in terms of relating to the research, it hopes that they'll be more honest, and when answering research questions and surveys and interviews, which can only make the program become better. And I feel like this is especially important because there's so many precarious ethics of white researchers working with or for alongside Indigenous communities. And I think that we talk a lot about consent in the program in terms of relationships. And so it's important to kind of model that like ongoing consent throughout the program as well. So it's not just like one step, it's like all the way through, and builds their ability to, again, say no or say yes in an even better, more open way. And so here's some little pictures from more little projects before. I play the video, and that's at one of our community events that I mentioned. There's the signpost forest in the background to give you an idea. There's the youth putting up the stop rape signs. There's a very interesting story behind the stop rape signs anyways. That's us with the red dress. And Ts'ídāne, that means thank you in Kaska. So is there time for me to show the video? Okay. So here, I'll stop share. Can you hear it? Perfect.
It fills my heart to see so many of you here. And I want to acknowledge and thank each and every one of you for being here. And I can never overemphasize how powerful each and every one of you are, and how powerful a voice you have.
What you're learning is life skills, like what you can do when there's violence. How could you support an individual when they're being violated? We don't really tolerate rape and stuff like that. We teach them those kind of things.
I've been going for 2 years now. I really like it because we're open, there's no judgment, and we all talk about our different points of views on different things and everything. It's a very good program to connect with younger people because it can teach you about topics that you don't really know that's even happening in different places around the world.
Sexual assault and rape and physical assault and violence against women and murdered and missing Indigenous women.
This is a subject matter, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It's near and dear to our hearts.
And we also learn about violence, how it affects an individual. We talk about racism, we talk about rape, we talk about all kinds of things that is so important for our young people to know.
They can teach you like what's going on and how you can stop it or stand up against it.
There's so much of it going on through the whole world, but there's not a lot of awareness about it, and it's kind of like hidden, so we're doing stuff to bring awareness to it and make it known so that it can be stopped.
Art is such a powerful tool for campaigns to change how we see things.
Red Dress was about showing missing, murdered Indigenous girls and women. It's out in the lobby for anyone to see, and it's kind of like the honor spirits, yeah. And just stay there and remind people what happened and teach them about it.
We did this one campaign where there was a sign that was hung up in Signpost Forest and it said "Don't rape," and it was taken down. So we had a bunch of advocates and all of us, and we went together and we wrote a letter to the government to find out where it went, and we went together to make more signs to put them up again.
Yeah, we're just trying to get a message out to the people that do stuff like that, and trying to open their eyes a bit more to see what people like them are doing to this community.
Honestly, if I could do anything, I'd probably stop rape.
They're trained to support whoever needs their help. And I think if youth decide that that's the kind of work they want to do, they're equipped to do those kind of things.
And that's what's going to prepare you. So you make better choices with your life.
So that's the kind of things that our children, the children in Youth for Dignity are taking. And when they work together, it really shows. They participated in a lot of icebreakers, team building exercise. We have a lot of shy individuals, but they participate in their own quiet way. And one of these days, maybe they're the ones that are going to be the leaders and be a role model to other youth.
I would say it's made me been able to be more open about stuff and my feelings and be able to talk to people about it and talk to them, and we can both help each other.
It's fun to be in there, and they always acknowledge the elders, which is really special.
And I really enjoy working with the youth here.
To me, it was really something special when I talked to you guys, you know? It's your learning.
So Kids and Data, Kids Ideas, yes, we're all learning together with the hopes that we can share this with other people as well.
I want you to always remember how very powerful you are when you use your voice.
Thank you for watching that. And yeah, I'll pass it back to Wendy.
All right, great. Thank you, Julie. And I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and information about your program. And it really highlights for us the importance that consent is ongoing, that it goes throughout the program, it goes throughout the research, and we constantly have to check in and create ways of gaining consent That's not only a one-off, sign this form or agree to this. So thanks for that. Okay, I'm going to just in the interest of time, just do a very brief sort of presentation because some of my points have been well covered. So Stacey, would you mind putting up the, thank you. So I just want to highlight, so one of the things, and that we've heard it as a theme, is that consent is a communication process and it's co-creation. That is that I work with the individuals or the community or the organization I create a relationship, and it's under that relationship that we can enable the consent process and that communication for the consent process to happen. So in our work, when we do that, that means we're able to contextualize or make the consent process fit where we are at. And so I want to give you just sort of some examples about how we've done it in our work to make it sort of come alive. So one of the things that we do is we take a multimedia approach. And in this approach, we've done different things, like we've created videos of consent so that we can have image-based, so to address some of those language barriers. For the youth themselves, we've created comic-like videos, to sort of make it more age appropriate and less language-based as well. And in it, we've sort of tried to demonstrate, what they have to do. We've created those videos with the youth in the agency that we're working with. And so those youth can tell us and identify the images that we're going to use. It actually doesn't take that long to create those videos and work with youth to do it. And it's a highly effective way of doing it, because that way we can be ensured that it's going to meet the needs of the youth, and it's going to be understandable to the youth because we've co-created that youth. We've co-created that with the youth. So we find that using a multimedia approach is really important. And when we look at some of those videos, what we find is that it allows us to have different language levels. It allows us to work with individuals who have come from different language backgrounds. We have many images that represent those 4 pieces that I talked about in the beginning that have to be present in the consent. And it also means that we can reduce the reading level that's required of those really complicated consent forms down to a grade 3 level or a grade 4 level, which is what we're aiming. We also have accompanying videos for the adults, whether that be the guardians, the parents, the caretakers, or the aunties, or whoever that is responsible. So we like the video approach. We've also used whiteboards as a way of doing it because it allows us to tailor to the partnership. It allows us to create that reputation. It allows us to do what Meghan talked about, to be flexible, to meet the needs. And it also allows us to simplify it. The other piece is that it's an engaging tool to begin to formulate that relationship with the agency that you're working with, because you spend time together identifying what is important. And so you have a way of getting to know one another in that co-creation process. So I think one of the things that we've learned during COVID is we have to be more creative about how we do these things. So we do it through multimedia, we do it online. And we also have ways that we've done with online surveys. Interestingly, in our research, we also do video calls with the parents or the guardians to get there and share our video, and then they sign off online. So I think we just have to, I think the thing that we've done in COVID is that we've learned to be creative about how we obtain consent. And it's made us think more deeply about the communities that we're going into to get that consent. Could I have the next slide, Stacey? I also want to tell you about how we've done some consent work and working in some of the Indigenous communities that we have been working with. Because what we learned as in our starting point with these communities is in building that relationship, that the kinds of ways that we ask, the kinds of elements that we put in, and the language that we use is highly inappropriate and does not fit that cultural context. So what we've done when we've gone into these communities is we work with 2 groups. We work with elders as well as we've worked with some knowledge keepers. And what they've done is they've worked with us to tell stories in order to obtain consent. So that is, they sort of through a process of discussion is we talk about the kinds of things that we have to put into the consent process that we're required to by our ethical. And they translate that in a way that reflects their culture and tells stories, to tell a story. And that will not only give an example of what, sort of that will exemplify what the research will be doing and why it will be, what will be required of the people that engage in it. So I really like that as an example, because again, going back to some of the themes that we talked about, it's about partnership. It's about putting it into the context that it is responsible, that's responsible and ethical, that will be more likely to be understood. And it's also gaining the support of the community and getting buy-in from the community for research, that if they see that this is something that is worthwhile, it's something that's going to help them grow and develop and provide benefits to that community, then they're going to engage with us to do it in a way that's ethically sound. So we find that working with the elders and the knowledge keepers in Indigenous communities has been a really important process of starting that first building block of research, and I guess, and also of shifting the way of thinking about how we obtain consent. Consent is not something that researchers are just now asking and requesting, but it's actually a relationship that gets formed, and it's a relational process, and it's an ongoing process. And one of the things that we do in one of the Indigenous communities that we work with is that they have sort of, because it's appropriate for there, is that when each time we visit, they have requested that we begin with the consent process. So that consent is not only something that we sign off in the beginning, or we ask people to sign off in the beginning, but it's ongoing and it's continuous. And that way they can, that it's also a way to ensure that people aren't feeling like they are coerced, or it's voluntary. They can feel that it's more voluntary, because just because they signed on day one doesn't mean they still have to be doing it as we continue the process. So I think that's been a really valuable lesson for us, is that thinking about consent as a process, thinking about consent as a relationship that we form with the communities, engaging the communities to develop the consent in a way that reflects themselves and they can see themselves and that they can understand, and that will help us get over some of those very critical language barriers. And then the last piece, which I just want to go back, because it sort of folds nicely onto Meghan's the framework that she put, is that it also is an ongoing support that can ensure that we're continuing to behave in ethical ways. So I really think that I hope you've had an opportunity today to hear about why we have to sort of how we can get consent, that we need to think about consent from a broader kind of perspective, that consent should not be research driven, but it should be a co-creation and a collaborative an adventure, and it should reflect the context that we're all working in. And those would be the themes that we hope that you would take away. And our primary duty, of course, is to do it. And I just want to again highlight something that Meghan said, is in a safe way, that we want to ensure that all the participants are going to be safe. So thank you. We're open. I'm going to open the floor for questions now. And Meghan, I need a drink too. The throat gets dry. You can type in your questions, or if you want to raise your hand, I think we can see you. Stacy?
Yes, we have the raise hand option if anybody
Okay, thank you.
would like to be unmiked.
Okay, I guess Meghan and Julie, did you have anything that you wanted to add, or anything that you've been reflecting on during this conversation that you would like to add?
Wendy, I'm actually curious to know more about some of the multimedia and videos that you've created and how you've been able to streamline your letter of information and get it down to like the grade 3 reading level, because I find our ethics board in particular anyways the detail that we have to put in, and sometimes dictating exactly how the wording is for it's there's just a lot of information, and how do you simplify that into a video? I would love to hear kind of how you've been able to do that and work with your ethics board.
So I think it's been a journey and a process. So I'll say that. And we do two things. We've started with the template of all the must-have elements. And part of our challenge is we actually change it for every study, but we have different pieces that we put on that can be the same. And so I think there's two things to understand. We've stripped down the written consent form as to basic as we can. And then we take those elements and we've actually created whiteboard scenarios that go over it with the pictures that are associated with it. And we actually have had to take those back to our REB, and we have to get them to sign off to say that it's done. And that was a process of literally like documenting at which time in the video was this particular thing covered, and they had to agree to that. And like the good news is that once we got enough support for like the basics, then we have like an add-on we actually cut in that's for the specific study that would talk about like the design and the, you know what I mean? Like, so there's sort of like the voluntary piece that you know, everybody gets, you know, the, you know, like, so it gets jigged a little bit, but once we got our first prototype approved, we were able to get approval for the others as we've gone along. And some of it has been harder, more challenged depending on the communities that we've gone into. And we actually had an Indigenous person come to an ethics meeting at one of ours.
That's really helpful. I'm definitely going to consider and look into that, because we definitely are trying different ways, but we're still often just reading the letter of information like word for word and trying to rephrase when needed for literacy. But yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you.
When we started, the first thing they let us do the video, but said we had to send the form too. And now it's actually taken almost 1.5 years where we now no longer have to have the long form. We can just use our videos.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Okay, Julie, do you have any thoughts or things you want to add?
Yeah, no, I think that it sounds like such a great idea in terms of having a different medium for that, and hopefully it can kind of ripple out and start to set some precedents of being like, okay, this is okay now, we can try this. Just yeah, I feel like that's such a more personal and like more real way of navigating consent, except for these forms. So yeah, thank you for sharing those tools.
Yeah, I really like what you just said, because it does, you know, I think you're right that there's a lot of work we have to do to advocate at the GR, the sort of the research ethics boards level to bring about change, because we have to sort of move from this legalese sort of white perspective to understand the different contexts. And I do think there's larger advocacy that needs to be done. Okay, well, we're nearing the end of our time. So again, I'd just like to thank our panelists for participating and sharing their knowledge and their expertise. And we all have learned something today. And so very grateful for your participation. I'd like to remind all of the individuals who are watching that we do have the evaluation form, and it will be put up in the chat box. If you could fill out that evaluation form. And once you do that, if you enter your email, then you'll be taken to your certificate of attendance. So thank you, everyone. Have a safe day, and we wish you well. Take care. Bye.